that way. Right. So I'm going to start with this first question because it says this: I was confused as to what degenerate means to de Gobineau and why it was so important. I think that's a good place to start because it lets us sort of think about what the main argument is. Right? He has this essay on the inequality of human races, and that's certainly the main focus of the essay. It's the focus of a little bit of music there being piped in from somewhere else. So the main focus is on inequality of human races. But the argument that he sort of begins with, the argument that we'll kick off with, certainly in our reading, is this sort of, Gobineau's trying to find out, he's trying to answer the question, why do civilizations die? Right? Why do civilizations die? And it's a question that a lot of people have asked and a lot of people have answered in many different ways. And de Gobineau's answer is quite unique to him, right? The thing that makes civilizations die, and actually I think the thing that makes nations die, the things that make individuals die for him as well, he says that later on, is the mixing of races. And so this, when he's talking about degeneration, that's what he's talking about. He's talking about the what he sees as the fall, right? The fall of the pure race. I almost want to say the pure races, but that might be too, because, and the reason why I want to say that, right, is because he does have these, he sets up these sort of three basic fundamental races, which he claims are sort of original races. There's an interesting thing there that he mentions, like some Adamic race, right? The first race, right? The one from, which surely should be common to all men. But he mentions it and says, but I'm not going to talk about that, of course. So I haven't read this full essay, right? I've only read what you've read in the reader here. I haven't studied de Gobineau very much at all. Nothing except for what we've read in there. But I do wonder, he doesn't explain it in this selection, and I wonder why he was not talking about an Adamic race, right? A first race that from where a common race, right, for us all, a common ancestor from us. But he certainly doesn't, and he explicitly avoids doing it, and explicitly says that he's not going to do it. So that's interesting. But he has these three basic races, which he characterizes by color. He says there's the white race, black race, and the yellow race. And he claims that the white race, of those three, the white is the superior, the others are inferior, and he gives basic characteristics of each of them. And so his idea, this mixing of races, right? So for him, as he says, he says that the white race is superior, and so this degeneration, right? This movement away from purity, right? From a pure white race, or for that matter, and that's why I wanted to say races, right? Because there's sort of a little bit more of a comfortable reading of de Gobineau, right? Where we said, well, he's talking about all the races degenerating, right? Because he gets into this sort of later on in the reading, but there is nobody on the earth, right? He doesn't say it in these words, but he strongly implies, right, that there's nobody left, right? It's purely any of those races. Right? He's not talking about you and me. He's not talking about anybody that's alive in the 1850s, because what he says, right, is that these races have mixed, right, and so there's no purely black race anymore. There's nobody that belongs only to a black race, or to a yellow race, or to a white race. But of course, because he says that the white race is the superior one, that is the one that he thinks is the strongest and the most intelligent. And interestingly, and somebody points this out, and we'll talk about this a little bit later when we meet this question, right? But not the most sensitive, not the one with the best senses, or the strongest feelings, actually. But he does definitely claim superiority for the white race. And so this is the because there's no because there's no purely black, or certainly purely white, or purely yellow members of those races anymore, that we're degenerating. And it's that degeneration in his mind that makes civilizations die. So why did the Roman civilization die? Why did the Egyptian civilization die? Any of the Greek civilization, he mentions a few of them, but he says the Assyrian, but he doesn't mention them all. He says the reason that they die is because they cease to be the thing that that their ancestors were, right? Because of the mixing of races. And he says this quite early on, that, you know, if you have, you know, he talks about blood a lot, right? This pure blood gets admixture, right? Gets mixed in, and that means that then they lose those characteristics, which for the white race in the Gobineau, right, is the most, I suppose, the most tragic for him, right? That there's those strengths, those attributes have been, you know, been weakened over time. And it's, you know, I'm trying to avoid saying this now because there's a question later on that talks about it, you know, the scientific nature of it, but he is very clearly, like, he's not you know, it's not science like you and I understand science. You know, he starts talking about the Iliad in there, right? He says, you know, the heroes in the Iliad, he's using those guys as examples, right, of this degeneration, right? We used to be, he says, but he says even those, right, even the heroes in the Iliad, they had admixture of blood as well. They weren't even purely one race or another race. But, you know, they were much more pure than we are, right? Much more pure than we are. And that's why they were so heroic and they could do all the things that we read about them doing, which, of course, you know, this is a work of fiction, right? So the fact that he's using that as the standard, you know, it's very easy if he's genuinely holding those guys up, those heroes, right, those half gods up as the standard. Then of course we understand what he means by degeneration, right? We're not that for the Gobineau. None of us are that. Anyway, so I think that's why it's important. So it's important because it's getting to that initial argument that he's making, that civilizations die because their blood becomes mixed, right? And they share less and less in common with the ancestors that started those civilizations, like the heroes in the Greek mythology. And that's what it means for the Gobineau. So the next question is Gobineau's notion that certain races are incapable of becoming knowledgeable stem from prejudice or observations over periods of time? And we don't get a lot in that reading. Again, I haven't, but I asked the same question of myself when I was reading it. Okay, give me some evidence. But again, the evidence that he gives us is from the Iliad, from the Iliad, right? Which I think seems to me, at least, and maybe seems to probably many of you, as a difficult comparison, difficult observation. If we like to think of ourselves as, you know, people interested in empirical science, right, and where we want to observe, which certainly this question is asking for us, right? Observations. This question is asking us, you know, observations over periods of time. It doesn't seem to be based on that. What it seems to be based on is, again, unless you count, you know, accounts of Greek mythology or Greek literature as periods of time, right? As observations over periods of time. The other thing it does seem to be based on, the other thing that we get in this section of reading, right, is a bit of phrenology, right, which of course is a science back in those days, but has since been let's say fallen out of favor. That's a fairly friendly way to describe it, right? It's not, but he's talking about the shapes of people's heads here, right? He's talking about the different shapes of people's heads and faces, and he's making deductions from that. You can see that in the text. He's making deductions from the shape of people's skull as to how energetic they are, for example, right, or how passionate they are, which was a popular science, I'm going to say, a popular way of understanding people, and certainly of different races and different nationalities and things in those days. But you know, that's sort of the science that it seems to be that he's basing some of this, at least in the sections that we've got. So yeah, I think the word prejudice, I want to point out there, and I want to sort of give it a little bit of special meaning, right, in our class, because when we mention prejudice in this class, I want us to think straight away of Berg and the conservatives, right? And I think you're probably using prejudice in this example in the way that we would probably use it today, right? Where we have, we don't know this person, or we don't know this group of people, and yet we claim to have some sort of knowledge, right? We claim to have some sort of understanding because of their racial stereotypes, or maybe nationalistic stereotypes as well in another place. But yes, I'm other than the phrenology, which is definitely in there, and other than the sort of comparisons with ancient Greek literature, which is in there, I suppose the other thing that's in there, that's in the background the whole time, is this idea of fallen civilizations, right? So all civilizations fall, he says, right, when they're born, and this includes individuals in this, right? When civilizations or nations are born, they're born, within them is born the seed of death, right? So that's quite, well, it's quite universal, is what I think, right? It's quite universalizing, right? Every civilization is going to die, but he says, the way that they die is they become not the thing that they were before. They become weaker through mixing blood. It's very biological here. So, so that's the other. I suppose the other observation over periods of time is he's observing the fall and the dissolution of civilizations and empires, and he's saying something's happening there. Something's these civilizations are degenerating. They're dying. They're getting old and dying, like people are. And of course, that doesn't follow from that right, certain races are incapable of becoming knowledgeable, like as is stated in the question. But this is sort of the evidence that he's bringing to bear, that he's trying to bring to bear, to exalt one race over another, but also because, again, remember, I don't think I can say this too much here, right? Because you don't want to fall into the trap of thinking that the races, those three races that he's talking about, they're not, he calls them, I think, primary races. These are not, don't correspond to people and nations and groups of people today, because we're all, again, mixes of those three primary ones, right? And we have secondary and tertiary, goes down the list. But yeah. What does Gobineau mean? This is the next question now. What does Gobineau mean when he's talking about how white people are less gifted when it comes to senses, and so must be tempted there. There's a G instead of a T, but otherwise it will be tempted. So it's less tempted by considerations of the body, but still the strongest. Yeah, he does early on, he does this characterization of these three primary races, white, black, and yellow. And one of the things that he says is that the black race has these much better senses than the other two races, right? They're much more, their senses are much more strong and much stronger, and so that's where he's getting on there, right? So I imagine, I don't remember the tempted by the considerations of the body, but I do remember where he talks about how the black race is satisfied, easily satisfied by anything, by any kind of food. Food features quite heavily in this article, interestingly, right? About what people eat, right, and how civilized, that what people eat is somehow a mark of civilization. He talks about eating a lizard or something like that. And there's another reading of the Gobineau that we could do that would sort of make him seem a little bit less scary, perhaps a little bit less out there. But you know, because he does say when he's talking about the food, I'm just remembering what from the lizard comment, right? He starts talking about how, look, there aren't any group of people on the earth today that are as barbarous as some people make out. You know, just because we land on their shores and they're firing arrows at us and eating the lizards, that doesn't mean that they're um, as savage as we might think, right? That might be a natural reaction. You know, he says, look, we seem to, and this seems interesting to me. This seems like if he really took this to heart, he might not have written a lot of what he wrote, right? Because he says, oh, you know, it seems like just because we like the people who we meet on that shore, as we get shipwrecked on that shore, just because we like them doesn't mean that they're a noble, great race. And if we don't like them, doesn't mean that they're a savage, awful race. Actually, you know, nobody's as great or as savage, right? Because there's this admixture, right? Which is sort of a bit of a nicer, more comfortable reading of him, but obviously, like that ignores quite a lot of the other things that he's writing. And I think, you know, it certainly, you know, makes me like that. I think that passage sort of draws attention to the fact that there's a particular person who's writing this and who's writing about these different races and who's giving some, you know, one group of at least one primary race different characteristics from another. Has better senses than the other one. One's stronger than the other one. One's more intelligent than the other one, right? One's more harmonious than the other one, I think. You know, one's more easily pleased than the other one. And I think, you know, when he gets into talking about the white race is the only one that, you know, all the others have to depend on for civilization. Without this white race, nobody's established any civilization. That's also quite tough. But so he's talking about how white people are less gifted when it comes to senses. So that's what he's saying. He thinks that there's really physical characteristics that differ in the races, and he thinks that that's one important one. But the strongest one still. And it might be worth, even for when we were thinking of the Gobineau, it might be worth, instead of saying, but still the strongest, but still was the strongest, because remember, and I think this is important, that, you know, those three races, again, they're not, they don't exist, they exist as sort of ancestors, as sort of antecedents, long into the past, you know, before ancient Greece, at least. And he says, yeah, so in Civilization and Race, how does Gobineau base his claims that all races are not equal compared to other fascist authors? Well, we can see that. We'll have a look going forward, right? I think we've already talked a little bit about how he bases his claims. And we've got, again, phrenology, you know, we've got the study of it. And anthropology in the 19th century, you know, was notorious for measuring heads, right, and shapes of heads and trying to make deductions based on that about characteristics, about physical characteristics, about mental characteristics of different people, depending on simply the shape of their head. So so that's prevalent in here, and also, as I said, right, he's also basing his claims on these sort of ancient literature, stories of, you know, we don't see anybody, Achilles. I might be giving away my lack of knowledge of ancient Greek literature, but assuming that Achilles was in the Iliad, which Gobineau particularly cites, you know, we don't know anybody who can only be killed by a cut to the heel, right? By a sword to the heel. We don't know anybody that's invincible in that way anymore. Well, so what the Gobineau is, I think, saying, at least my reading, he's saying, well, because we don't know anybody like that anymore, we can see this degeneration, right? And that originally people were more like that. I don't know. So again, that's where he's basing his claims. We can keep that in mind and compare it to other fascist authors as we go forward. We've got two more that will cover another one. And then finally, how did men like Gobineau have a voice when using little to no science to base their beliefs off of? And I think there's a couple of things, a couple of directions that I go here, right? One of them is that certainly there were fewer people to read. There were fewer people writing in those days, right? And he's obviously in a privileged position as an ambassador. He's a high-profile figure. You know, and perhaps that's still true today. The other thing that I get is still true today, that you know, people in high-profile positions, you know, a lot more people are literate, perhaps. A lot more people are writing than in the past, if we think of the internet especially. But you know, who gets read, right? Isn't it the most high-profile people get read, perhaps? And so being a member of a particular class at a particular time in a particular place, maybe that gets him the notoriety. Well, also I think, though, and I'm going to have another 2 points here, but also the second point is that the voice that he gets, part of the only reason we're reading him today, right, is because of the importance of these ideas to fascism. And so, of course, the fascists and the success, the relative success of the fascists, at least in the sort of beginning to middle of the 20th century, the success was fairly short-lived, thankfully. But the fascists drew on him and sort of brought him into the light, and I suppose associated this sort of thinking with their barbarous ideology, right, and their actions, right, that now sort of traumatized in the latter half of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century as we are from the actions of the fascists and of the Nazis. That's how he gets the voice, right, because we're horrified still, right, and certainly before he got the voice because maybe the Nazis were. So that's another point. And then the third point, and this addresses sort of the little to no science to base their beliefs off. Science, and what we think of as science, has changed tremendously in the past almost 200 years, right, since de Gobineau was writing this. And certainly at the time, and de Gobineau is not the only one that was doing these sorts of racial theories, but this is where science really was. And it's tempting for us to look back on that time and in lots of ways right. In this way, it's very poor science, right? It's very little science, very elementary, if anything, right? I mean, even elementary might be too much to grant de Gobineau, but there's almost little to no science, right? But it's worth looking at the progress of science since then, right? It's worth looking at the changes, and it's also worth noting that if that amount of change about what counts as science and what constitutes science, right? Phrenology counts as science in the 1850s. What counts as science then, and what counts as science now, and I think it's also always worth noting that, who knows, right? Maybe in another 200 years, will the science that we currently have look like phrenology looks to us now? And is that a benefit to humanity if that does happen, right? If we become even more and more scientifically advanced, but always, I suppose, ultimately, always being aware, right, that what we now count as sort of infallible, not maybe infallible is much too strong a word, but is very useful and very important and very almost indisputable science knowledge might not be as useful and vital as we can, because when we look back, that's what this counted as science in those days, right? So part of it is certainly time, and then the other things, right, being a prominent figure, being one of a more limited number of intellectuals of the time, and the state of science as it was then. So, and then being sort of brought into view by the relative success of fascism, and then by the horror, the post-fascist horror that I suppose that we felt, that we can look back and sort of say, look what they were spouting, look what they were saying, look at these. And again, right, we're not calling de Gobineau a fascist, right, because that would be anachronistic, but we are saying, like, look, his ideas, his thoughts, his writings are certainly influential in Nazism, right, and in the horrors that occurred. All right, so I will then leave it there. I'll leave de Gobineau there, and I'll make another couple of videos this week on the other two readings that we had. And I wish you all a good week. I'll mention, if anybody gets to this point in the video, I'll mention that we do have the midterm makeup exam is coming up next week. I highly recommend, as I have on my announcement already, but I highly recommend that you look at the feedback that I gave, the general feedback on the midterm, because that's still going to be very relevant. I'm still going to, you know, the exam's going to look very similar, although the questions will be different, but the exam will look similar to the midterm, and I'll grade it in the same way. Of course, the difference is now that you will have open book, so you will be able to, but you should still definitely be referring to readings and things. That's going to get you more points. So I'll leave you with that, and with all of my best wishes, and we'll see you next time.